Now we'll see that the show command in JunOS actually has two different separate usages. It depends on whether we are in operational mode or whether we are in configuration mode. Now in operational mode, this is mainly going to be to check the status of the system. So what are the interface counters? What is the routing table? What are the BGP peerings? This is similar to iOS commands that you would run in normal user mode or exec mode. But the difference is that the commands will overlap sometimes between operational mode and config mode. So for example, if we were to say in operational mode, so let's exit out of here, and we're going to say show interfaces gig E000, and if we were to do this from config mode, show interfaces gig E000, it's an identical command, but we see it has two different outputs. And coming from iOS, this is a little bit confusing to begin with because the show command in config mode is essentially the show run command in iOS. So when you're trying to verify the state of the system, like a variable value, like how many packets came in the interface, or what's the routing table, what are the particular IGP neighbors, those commands or those verifications need to be run from operational mode, not from config mode. Any show command that you're doing in config mode is talking about show run or showing the config, not talking about the state of the system. Now we'll see that you can actually run the operational mode commands from config mode, which is going to be the equivalent of the do command in iOS. But before we get to that, when we're talking about show commands in operational mode, just like in iOS, they have multiple levels of detail. Now the levels of detail from least to most are terse, brief, detail, and extensive. Where the most common one that we would see as coming from iOS would be something like show interfaces terse. This is the logical equivalent of show IP interface brief. So it's showing the interfaces, showing their address families like IPv4 addresses, IPv6 addresses, but it's not giving you all the details like what are the packet counters, what are the errors on the interface, etc. So if we were to look at this output, let's say from operational mode, show interfaces, then like I mentioned, we have the multiple levels, so we could say show interfaces terse, show interfaces brief, show interfaces detail or extensive. And if we show interfaces terse, like I mentioned, this is the logical equivalent of show IP interface brief. So it says these are the actual ports that I have. GE is for our gigabit Ethernet. We can see this is the specific naming convention inside of the system. So it's based on the chassis, the slot number, the particular port number. And of course, this is going to vary depending on what particular physical platform that you're working with. So if you're working on a T-Series or MX or SRX, the naming convention for the port numbers is going to be a little bit different. But beyond that, when we're looking at the logical options, it's the same type of logic as we see in regular iOS. So what's the administrative status of the link? Is it shut down? Is it disabled? Or is it no shutdown? Is it enabled? Which in the case, the port would be up. Then we have the layer 2 link status. So if the link is up, it means that it could be used for actually forwarding traffic. So if the link is down, it means that there's a physical cable problem. If the link is up, maybe there's a layer 2 encapsulation problem. If the link is administratively down, it means that we just manually disabled it. Then we can see beyond this, we also have the address families where INET, again, it means IPv4. INET6 means IPv6. And we'll see as we get to more details here, this is also where we would see ISO if we're running ISIS routing. We would also see Ethernet switching if we're running layer 2 switching, and MPLS if we're running MPLS label switching. Now in terms of running the show command in config mode, as I mentioned, this is the logical equivalent to show run in iOS. So you can look at the running configuration, or the active configuration, I should say, from operational mode, and the way that you would do this is by saying show config. So show config from operational mode, that's the equivalent of show run in iOS. Now, if you're already in config mode and you just say show, that's the equivalent of do show run in iOS. So it's doing the same thing here, but it's talking about specifically where are you at the hierarchy. So if I were to say edit system and then show, this is the equivalent of show run pipe section something in the case of iOS. So we'll see that JunOS also does have pipes for doing filters, but you don't necessarily need to use the pipes when you're trying to sort through the parser hierarchy. So this means that if I'm configuring something at the interface level and I simply say show, it's going to show me only the configuration that is at that particular interface based on where I am in the parser's hierarchy. But just keep in mind here that it's the same command with two different functions. If you're saying it in config mode, it's talking about show me the running config. If you say it in operational mode, it's saying show me the result of the routing table, show me the result of the interfaces, etc. So like I mentioned, we could do this from root, or you can do it from a lower level in the hierarchy. When you simply say show, it's going to say show me wherever I am. I'm under interfaces under Gigi 000. So if we were to think about some of these parallels, show config from operational mode, like I mentioned, that's the equivalent of show run in iOS. If we issue just show in config mode in Juniper, that's do show run in iOS. Show interfaces Gigi 00 from config mode would be do show run interface. Or if we said show me protocol OSPF, that would be show run pipe section router OSPF in iOS. So they don't have one-to-one parallels we'll see for a lot of the features, but they're relatively close enough that if you understand what you're trying to verify to begin with, a lot of the time there is going to be a parallel from iOS into JunOS and back. Now, as I mentioned, you could also run operational mode commands from config mode, which is with the run command. So this is the logical equivalent of the do command in iOS, where if we were to say show interfaces in a config mode, that's talking about show me the config of the interfaces. If I said run show interfaces, this is the show interface command from operational mode. Now we'll see that there are certain things that you cannot issue with the run command. You may need to actually exit out of the config in order to issue those commands. And then when we do go from configuration mode back to operational mode, it's going to tell us whether we have unsaved changes or basically uncommitted changes that will not get discarded by default, but they're not going to be applied if we exit from config mode to operational mode without actually saving them. So if we say exit here, it says you have config changes that you made, but you didn't commit them yet. Do you still want to exit? If we say yes, it doesn't mean those changes are discarded. Now, this is different when we compare this to iOS XR, where in the case of XR, if we were to go to global config and make some change, let's say we create a loopback 1, 2, 3, 4, and we try to exit, it says there's uncommitted changes, and if we leave, it's going to discard them. So do I want to commit them? No, I don't. Basically, this means that the commit was aborted. So it's not saving those changes for later, it's deleting them. And that's one of the key differences here between JunOS and iOS XR, that in JunOS you still have those changes saved in the candidate config, but they're not yet committed. I could still go back to configuration mode and commit the changes, and those would save them. Now we'll see when we go to actually look at what are those particular changes, the way that we do that is to say show pipe compare. So show pipe compare, this is the equivalent in iOS XR of when we go to make a change, loopback 1, 2, 3, 4, and we simply say show or show config. Essentially what this is showing is your uncommitted changes. In the case of JunOS, it's going to say what commands are you adding, the plus, and then it might also show a minus sign here of what commands are you deleting. Now also we'll see, just like in iOS, you can also filter through this output when you're looking at a show for the running config, whether you're looking at a show for interface properties or the routing table. There's different ways that you can sort through the output, but we'll see that there's a lot of logical equivalence between JunOS and iOS, where the first of which we have is match. This is the equivalent to include in iOS, where if we say show interfaces match MTU, that would be the equivalent of show interfaces pipe include MTU in regular iOS. We have except, which is going to be to not match. This is the equivalent of exclude in iOS. We have find, which is going to be the equivalent of begin. So show me the output, but start at that particular line. So in the case of iOS, if we were to say show interfaces gig1, pipe begin MTU. In JunOS, this would be the show interfaces pipe find MTU, and it starts with that first particular line. Now the other one that's going to be very useful is the pipe display set command. What this shows us in JunOS is the flat configuration that's not listed in the full configuration hierarchy. And what I mean by this, it's going to show you what commands would you actually need to issue in order to get this result of the active config. Now, as we looked at the full default configuration, you see that there's lots of options in there in JunOS by default. When we look at the show config from operational mode, and you can see that there's lots of detailed levels to the parser hierarchy. But if we were to say show config pipe display set, this shows me what are the actual commands that would need to be issued in order to make those particular changes. So as you'll see here, there's really not that many commands that are needed in order to get to this final end result. Now we'll see one of the big portions of the default syntax for the SRX boxes is going to be the firewall filters, because they're meant to be stateful firewalls like ASA in Cisco or like the zone-based policy firewall. Now in our particular case, we're not really going to be focusing on the stateful firewall features, so mainly we're just going to remove this, and we're going to be looking at JunOS from just a basic routing configuration. Now the reason that this is important to note though is that once we go to the operations of IP routing, of MPLS label switching and other things like multicast, for example, normally those packets would be dropped by the SRX because they're trying to go through the stateful firewall filter. Now in order to turn this off, and I'm going to come back to this later and talk about this again, there's a couple different commands that we need to issue in a config mode, basically to turn off the stateful firewall. And what we would do is go to config mode, and we're going to delete the security config. Then there's a couple different commands, and I'm just going to paste these in, and we're going to talk about these a little bit later, which is set security forwarding options, family MPLS ISO and INET6 to mode packet-based. The default value for this is flow-based, which basically means stateful firewall. So in this case, I'm saying don't go through the inspection engine in order to figure out whether we want to allow a packet to come in or out. But the thing that's important about this is that if you are using the VSRX, which is that Firefly perimeter router that I was talking about, by default it does behave as a stateful firewall. So for simplicity, we're just going to be turning this off, and then we'll talk about later some of the features for the filtering. So once we actually save these changes, and actually what I'm going to do here first, I'll talk about this, what these commands mean that I'm actually doing, but I'm going to delete security, and then set the other address families to packet-based, save this config and exit, so commit and quit. But once we do this, it says you have to reload. So we need to request a system reboot. Okay, and I'm going to do this to the other SRX boxes after we take a break. But again, basically what this is doing is reverting it out of the stateful firewall mode. That it's just going to be a normal router, it's going to be a normal layer 2 Ethernet switch as well. Now when this comes back up, and if we were to say show config, pipe display set, all of those options that were previously under security If we scroll back up here, basically all of these policies would then be deleted. Okay, the other option that's useful here is the display detail. This says to show me the result of the syntax or show me the particular output, but then it also includes comments about what is the specific usage for that piece of syntax. So for example, if we were to say on one of the other routers, let's go ahead and log in as root. And let's start the CLI. Then we're going to go to config mode. And let's say we show interfaces, which again, in the case of iOS, this is the equivalent of show run interfaces, or specifically from global config, it would be do show run interfaces. So if we were to say show interfaces pipe display detail, it shows us the config, but it shows it basically with the programming comments. So for example, here under Ethernet switching, it tells you this is where you have the VLAN parameters. This is the member for the interface. Basically, this is the equivalent of the switchport access VLAN command in the case of Catalyst. There's a VLAN whose name is VLAN-trust. And this command is assigning the membership to the particular interface. So if there's a piece of syntax that you don't know of what it's doing, if you say show and then pipe display detail, you can at least look at what are the comments that are from the actual code base. Now additionally, JunOS also does support multiple pipes. So in this case, if we were to say show interfaces terse, pipe except down, pipe match inet, this would say show me the quick output of the interfaces, but show me the ones that are not down, and also out of that output, only show me the ones that have IP addresses assigned. So it's basically doing a logical AND between the matches. So if I were to say show interfaces terse, and we need to run that from config mode, so let's say run show interfaces terse, and let's say run show interfaces terse pipe match, let's say 0/0. Okay, so that was excluding these other interfaces like PP0, PPE0. But then if we were to say match those, but also we'll say except ETH switch and match inet, you can see you can keep going in multiple pipes. So it's ANDing them together. It's saying match 0/0 and not ETH-switch and inet, and then we have the end result of it. So anytime you're parsing a very long output, this starts to become useful if you're trying to narrow in on some very, very specific value. Like if you're looking at the full internet routing table, 500,000+ routes, and you're looking for something very specific, then it can be useful to have these multiple pipes at the same time.